And good evening and or good afternoon, whatever. We're all together here in Kenai in the afternoon, and we're continuing our discussion of the Chronological Bible. And we are on week 4, and week 4 covers the reading from Exodus 1:1 through Exodus 24:18. And if I've got it right, and I could easily be messed up, this covers January 22nd through January 28th. As I said at the close of business last time, our reading today starts 400 years approximately, 380, 370, somewhere in there, years after the last passage we read. And I would remind you that as Joseph stated to his brothers, this was all organized by God for good for the people, for all the people who loved him. Note specifically that God was kind not only to Joseph and Jacob and his family, he was also actually being kind to Egypt. Now, I don't know that anybody in Egypt at that time loved God, but apparently they were willing to recognize him to some degree by promoting Joseph to such a high position of authority. So both Joseph and Egypt benefited from that move of Jacob's family down to Egypt from the Promised Land, from Canaan. And recall, they owned no property except a burial site in Canaan at that point anyway. So during the intervening years, the original series of pharaohs have been replaced. And it appears to me, as an amateur observer, that Egypt has probably degenerated spiritually. I have to wonder whether or not the Pharaoh of this time would have had any problems at all with taking Abraham's wife, even though it's true Abraham had lied that she was his sister. It's interesting that the Pharaoh when Abraham was there, recognized that he was somehow engaged in a sin. Mr. Smith, in our notes, the commentary notes, tells us that this is a more sophisticated Egypt. And I would have to say that that is a perfect choice of words. Egypt is indeed more sophisticated at the current time of our reading. I say that because I would note to you that the word sophisticated is closely allied with the word sophistry, which the Oxford Dictionary defines as follows: the use of fallacious arguments, especially with the intention of deceiving. I believe indeed the Egyptian government was a great deal more sophisticated at this time than they had been during the time of Joseph. In their sophistication, I would note to you that one of the stratagems that they wanted to apply was the killing of babies, which they thought would be really good for their nation. I wonder if this was the final straw in their degradation process that led God to say, this is it. It is time for our people to be removed from this place. Once again, God brings a man, a particular man, in this case Moses, out of a very difficult situation, a difficult start to his life, and he becomes, in our reading, the leader of all the Hebrews. And that's exactly what God did with Joseph at the time of Jacob's trip to Egypt. And the result of our reading, is that Egypt is ruined by the extraction of the Hebrews. There were 10 plagues. And note that early on, the arrogant sophisticates, at least quite amazingly in my view, said that Moses' signs were easily replicated. Now, as you may recall, at least once, the story was that he threw down the staff. Staff became a stick. The magicians were able to say, trivial, we can do that. We're arrogant, we can do that. They created several snakes out of a staff, and the God-inspired staff consumed all of the other staffs. Why they didn't find that to be surprising, I do not know. But again, when you're arrogant, it's easy to say, well, this is fine. So I would like to now show you the cover of a magazine I received recently. This is called Teaching from Zion. And notice the interesting title, Plagues. And it's a discussion of plagues in the Bible in general. And specifically, Joe Shulam, who visited Soldotna, I don't know, between 15 and 20 years ago, I don't know exactly when. He came here, and that was when I began supporting their little activity. I'm not sure that everybody would agree that's a good activity. These are Christian Jews in Israel, and that's the point of teaching from Zion. But nonetheless, this is the interesting summary that Mr. Shulam offered. He said the following in this document that I have here. The arrogant false gods were struck down one by one. The first was Hapi, the Nile goddess. So that was when the Nile was turned to blood. Then the god Heket, the goddess of fertility, was in a way struck down. This was a goddess that had a frog image, and the frogs overwhelmed the country. Third, the lice. This guy says that this struck down Geb, G-E-B, the god of earth, because the dust became lice. The fourth god, Khepri, K-H-E-P-R-I, was struck down or reduced by the flies because that god had a head of a fly. The fifth was Hather, H-A-T-H-E-R, and that's because that god was symbolized as a cow, and the cattle were struck by a disease. The sixth, ashes created the boils. This was symbolic of Isis, the goddess of medicine. Seventh, the hail, the goddess of the sky. I can't read my note here. I think it was N-U-T, Nut, the goddess of the sky. The eighth was the plague of locusts, which was characterized as a storm of locusts. And Seth was the god of storms. And finally, the ninth god struck down was Ra, the god of sun, the sun god, because the whole land was turned to darkness. So all these plagues, and this is the point that I would like to make and Mr. Shulam made, these plagues were all created clearly by God, not by Satan. So the last thing I'd like to point out is this passage from the article by Mr. Shulam, in which he notes to us, I am simply going, this will be up here for a few seconds. You can read the whole thing. But the only part I'm going to read is the part in parentheses where he tells us that the word for plague here is in fact Hanegef, H-A-N-E-G-E-F. I have no idea how to spell that. I could maybe come close to spelling it in Arabic, but that's Hebrew text. It could mean virus. Isn't that interesting? In Hebrew, a virus is a nagif, N-A-G-I-F, and he claims that's the same root word. So what can we say? These plagues were clearly sent to strike down the arrogant, sophisticated Egypt. And that is what happened in spades. And that's the last comment I will make on this particular section of of Bible. I will invite you to resume reading as we carry on to see the people creating the new tabernacle in our next reading. So with that, I bid you a fond good afternoon or evening and hope that you'll join us again when it becomes convenient.